small team of geneticists cracked open the bones of a man buried on a windswept island off the coast of Ireland. He'd been dead for almost 4,000 years. They weren't expecting to find anything that would matter outside a lab. What they found instead quietly broke a story Ireland, Scotland, and half the Western world had been telling about themselves for 2 centuries. Because according to that story, the Celts came from Central Europe from Austria, from the Alps, and spread west, bringing their language, their art, their identity, all the way to the edge of the Atlantic. That story is in your textbooks. It's on your ancestry report. It's probably somewhere in your own family's mythology, if you've got any Irish, Scottish, Welsh, or Breton blood at all. But when scientists actually tested the DNA, not the pottery, not the swords, not the old Roman rumors, the actual DNA, the map didn't match the myth. Not even close. So who are the Celts really closest to? By the end of this video, you'll know the answer, and it's going to force you to rethink what that word Celtic has actually meant this whole time. If you've ever spit into a tube and mailed it off to a DNA testing company, you know the moment. You open the results, and there it is, a slice of your ancestry pie labeled Celtic, or Irish, Scottish, and Welsh, or British Isles. And for a second, it feels like an answer, like you finally know where you're from. But here's the uncomfortable question almost nobody asks next. What does that label actually mean? Genetically, who decided that Celtic was even a genetic category in the first place? Because Celtic didn't start as a bloodline. It started as a word Greek and Roman writers used for a group of tribes they mostly feared and rarely understood. It was a label for a language and a lifestyle, not a population you could trace back to one ancestral village. So when a DNA company tells you you're Celtic, what are they really measuring? That's the mystery we're going to unravel today. And the answer starts almost 2,000 miles from where you'd expect. Let's start with the story most of us grew up with. The Celts, we're told, were a sprawling network of tribes, fierce warriors, brilliant metalworkers, master storytellers who once controlled a huge stretch of ancient Europe. Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Brittany, and France. Even parts of Spain and northern Italy carry Celtic place names to this day. Archaeologists trace the roots of Celtic culture to 2 Iron Age sites in Central Europe, Hallstatt in the mountains of Austria, and La Tène on the shores of a Swiss lake. Starting around 800 BC, the artifacts, the art style, the burial customs associated with these sites appear to spread outward west into France and the British Isles, south into Italy, east into the Balkans. The traditional theory, sometimes called Celtic from the East, says this cultural wave carried real people with it. Migrating tribes moving out of the Alps, eventually settling the far edges of the Atlantic, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and becoming the ancestors of the people we call Celtic nations today. It's a clean story. It's dramatic. It's the one on the plaques in half the museums in Europe. There's just one problem. When geneticists finally had the tools to actually test it, to look not at pottery styles or sword designs, but at the DNA sitting inside ancient bones, the story didn't hold up the way anyone expected. Back to that island off the Irish coast, a small wind-battered stretch of land called Rathlin Island. In 2016, a research team led by geneticists at Trinity College Dublin published a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that quietly rewired how we think about Irish, and by extension, Celtic ancestry. They sequenced the genomes of ancient people found in Ireland. 1. A Neolithic farmer woman who lived around 3,300 BC, and 3 men buried on Rathlin Island roughly 1,000 years later during the Bronze Age. Around 2000 BC, the Neolithic woman's DNA looked like what you'd expect from early European farmers closer to populations from the Mediterranean and the Near East. Nothing shocking there. But the Bronze Age men were a different story entirely. Their DNA showed a massive genetic shift, a wave of ancestry linked to the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the grasslands north of the Black Sea, thousands of miles to the east. And critically, Their genetic profile already closely resembled that of modern Irish and Scottish people. Here's why that detail matters so much. This genetic transformation happened during the Bronze Age, roughly 1,000 years before the traditional Celtic, Hallstatt, and Latin cultures even existed in Central Europe. In other words, the genetic foundation of the modern Irish and Scottish population was already largely in place before the Iron Age culture we call Celtic had even been invented. So if the genes were already there, where did they actually come from? If not from Alpine Celtic tribes marching west. Let's pause the science for a second, because I want you to sit with something. Imagine finding out that the country your family has always pointed to as where we're really from, the flag on your grandmother's kitchen wall, the accent your grandfather never lost, isn't actually your closest genetic relative. That somewhere else, a place your family has no cultural connection to at all, shares more of your actual DNA than the homeland you grew up idolizing. That's not a hypothetical. That is, quite literally, what the genetics of Celtic identity are telling us. And it raises an uncomfortable question that applies way beyond Ireland or Scotland. How much of where you're from is actually about biology, and how much of it is a story we've agreed to tell each other? Keep that question in your back pocket. We're about to answer it with actual numbers. So let's trace that Bronze Age wave back to its source. Starting around 4,500 years ago, a wave of people archaeologists call the Bell Beaker culture, named after their distinctive bell-shaped pottery, began spreading across Western Europe. A landmark 2018 study published in Nature, led by researchers including David Reich and Inigo Olalde, tested ancient genomes across this beaker world and found something staggering. In Britain, the arrival of beaker-associated people coincided with a replacement of roughly 90% of the existing gene pool within a few centuries. Not a slow blending, a near-total genetic turnover. These incoming populations carried significant ancestry from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the same eastern grassland source showing up in those Rathlin Island bones in Ireland. So the genetic story of the British Isles isn't really a story about Alpine Celtic tribes at all. It's a story about a much earlier, much larger population movement, rooted ultimately in the steppes north of the Black Sea, that arrived a full millennium before Celtic culture existed as archaeologists define it. Which means the people we now think of as the most Celtic populations on Earth, the Irish, the Scottish, the Welsh, were genetically formed by a completely different historical event than the one traditionally credited with making them Celtic in the first place. So the culture came from one direction, the genes came from another, and that split is exactly where things get interesting. Here's where the scientific argument really catches fire. The traditional model, Celtic from the East, says Celtic language and identity radiated outward from the Hallstatt and Latin cultures of Central Europe, arriving in the British Isles relatively late during the Iron Age, well after the genetic transformation we just talked about had already happened. But a rival theory, championed by archaeologist Barry Cunliffe and linguist John Koch, flips the map entirely. It's called Celtic from the West. Their argument: the earliest layers of Celtic language may not have originated in the Alps at all. They may have developed along the Atlantic coast, Berea, France, the British Isles, Ireland, among Bronze Age communities that were already deeply connected by sea trade routes, moving copper, tin, and gold up and down the Atlantic seaboard centuries before Hallstatt ever became fashionable inland. If that's right, then the genetic wave we traced back to the steppe and the cultural label Celtic might not have arrived together at all. The DNA could have been in place, first carried by Bronze Age beaker-descended populations, and the language and identity we call Celtic may have grown up locally along that same Atlantic trade network, only later exchanging influence with Central Europe rather than being planted by it. To be clear, this is still genuinely debated among archaeologists and linguists. There's no unanimous verdict. But the genetic evidence has undeniably strengthened the case that the old Celts marched in from Austria story is, at best, incomplete. Now here's the detail that tends to catch people completely off guard. When population geneticists compare the genomes of modern Irish, Scottish, Welsh, Cornish, and Breton people to populations across Europe, the closest matches beyond each other often trace back toward the Iberian Peninsula, specifically toward Basque and northern Spanish populations, who carry some of the deepest, most distinctive ancestral signatures on the continent. Meanwhile, the modern populations living in and around Hallstatt and Latin Austria, southern Germany, the Czech Republic, the very heartland of Celtic archaeological culture, show a genetic profile shaped by entirely different, largely separate population movements over the last several thousand years. Let that sink in. The place culturally credited with inventing Celtic identity is, genetically, more distant from the modern Celtic nations than a region most people never even associate with the word Celtic at all. This doesn't mean the Basques are secretly Celtic, and researchers are careful about that distinction. Basque language and culture are, in fact, famously unrelated to Celtic languages, one of Europe's true linguistic isolates. But underneath the language, underneath the culture, the deep ancestral genetic threads connecting the Atlantic fringe of Europe run older and closer than the shared word Celtic would ever suggest. So which one actually defines who the Celts are, the DNA or the label? So let's finally answer the question in the title. Who are the Celts closest to, genetically, according to the science we actually have? First and closest, each other. Studies mapping fine-scale genetic structure across the British Isles, including major work published in Nature, analyzing tens of thousands of DNA samples, consistently show that Irish, Scottish, Welsh, Cornish, and Breton populations form their own tight genetic cluster, distinct even from their English neighbors, who carry a heavier signature of later Anglo-Saxon and Germanic ancestry. Second, the broader Atlantic fringe. Deep, shared ancestral components connect this cluster to populations along the old Atlantic trade corridor, coastal France, and further south into Iberia. Third, and most surprising of all, their genetic distance from the actual Hallstatt-La-Ten Celtic heartland of Central Europe is greater than the cultural story would ever lead you to expect. The word Celtic survived the journey west far better than the bloodline the word was originally attached to. So the Celts, in the genetic sense that actually matters, are closest to each other and to their Atlantic neighbors, not to the mountain valleys where the word Celtic was first coined by outsiders looking in. So back to that ancestry report sitting in your inbox. When it says Celtic, what is it actually measuring? It's measuring a genetic signature, one shaped mostly by that Bronze Age steppe migration and the deep Atlantic ancestry layered beneath it that happens to be concentrated in modern Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and Brittany. It's not measuring warriors in blue woad paint. It's not measuring druids, harps, or Braveheart. It's measuring population history that predates the word Celtic by 1,000 years and would have existed with or without a single Hallstatt artifact ever being made. Which means the identity you feel when you see that word on a report, the pride, the connection, the sense of belonging that's real, and it's yours to keep. But the science underneath it tells a stranger, older, and honestly more interesting story than the one on the box. You're not carrying the DNA of Iron Age alpine tribesmen. You're carrying the DNA of Bronze Age travelers who crossed a continent long before Celtic was ever a word anyone spoke. Before we close, one honest note, because this field moves fast and it deserves care. Ancient DNA studies are built from a genuinely small number of preserved skeletons, recovered from sites where bone happened to survive thousands of years in the right conditions. Every new burial site tested has the power to refine or even complicate the picture we just walked through. The steppe migration, the Beaker expansion, the Atlantic genetic cluster, all of this is the best current reconstruction from real data, not a closed case file. And genetic ancestry itself is not the same thing as identity. Populations mixed, migrated, and intermarried constantly across thousands of years. No modern group is a genetically pure descendant of any single ancient population, Celtic or otherwise. What the DNA gives us is a set of statistical signals, read carefully, pointing toward the shape of real history, not a family tree with your name already written on it. So here's where we land. Genetically, the Celts of Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and Brittany are closest to each other, and to a deep, ancient Atlantic lineage stretching down toward Iberia, not to the alpine valleys where the word Celtic was born. Which leaves one enormous question hanging in the air. If the bloodline didn't come from Hallstatt or Latin, how did the Celtic language get to Ireland at all? Language doesn't fossilize in bone. You can't sequence a word. In part 2, we're going to chase that impossible question all the way down. Tracing how a language with no genetic paper trail somehow conquered an island, using clues buried not in DNA, but in the words themselves. And the leading theory about where it actually started might be the strangest twist in this entire story. If part 1 changed how you see the word Celtic, part 2 is going to change how you see the word itself. Subscribe, and I'll see you there.